Hello and welcome to the Curiosity and Consciousness podcast with me, Karen Maloney. I am your host, and the intention of this podcast is to help us open our minds, get curious about ourselves, and to raise our vibration and consciousness levels. Through these conversations, we hope that you will go on an inward journey to discover the truth of who you are and to become aware of your own energy and vibration. We have the power to consciously create our lives, but we need to wake up to this fact before we can begin the process and learn the key of self-responsibility. Check out the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Acast, Castbox, or whatever platform you listen on, and please like, subscribe, and share the podcast. Leave a review, leave a rating, as this will help it to reach more people. Check out my website as well, Soul Power Light, www.soulpowerlight.com. Hello everybody, welcome. Thank you for tuning in again. This is the second episode of this new year, 2021. How are you all doing so far? How are you holding up with things that are going on? I don't know if you've seen it, but I've seen one of those memes or whatever you call them about 2021. I signed up for the 7-day free trial subscription and I want to cancel. So if you're feeling a little like that, know that it's okay, and always the way to move out of those emotions or frustration is to feel it, honor it, allow it, don't judge it, don't try resist it, and then drop back into the present. You know, what is in front of you? What can you appreciate? What does bring you joy? And do that. So keep going, chin up, and of course, podcasts. Listen to today's episode, listen to other podcasts and other episodes from this podcast as well, and it will bring you lots of tools and skills and resources to move through the challenges. And today I have a topic that is actually really relevant for the times that we're going in between 2020 last year and this year as well. And my guest today is Victoria Volk, and she is an advanced grief recovery specialist. And grief doesn't just pertain to death, but also that sense of loss of maybe routine or something you really enjoyed or the little things that you loved. So grief is something that touches us all. And Victoria was a 30 plus year griever, and she has navigated grief and loss the majority of her life. And she's found her purpose in her pain. And today she helps other grievers move beyond loss as an advanced grief recovery specialist, and she works both in person and online. She's also a Reiki master, self-published author, and hosts her own podcast called Grieving Voices, which is available on all platforms. So again, a really fantastic conversation for today. And again, like that, grief and loss is something that we all go through and we all feel at different levels. And like that, it's not just associated with death. So in this conversation, Victoria shares about her work and also her journey, and how her father passed away at a young age, and how there wasn't really a lot of conversation around what happened. So she never really processed it, and she learned to associate grief as a solo or an isolating process, something that you do alone. So now she helps others. She says grief has been her greatest teacher, and she is grateful for the experiences to bring her to the work that she does now in helping others to feel their grief and to heal it. And I love a topic that she talks about, that if we don't feel our emotions or our grief, we will either implode or explode. And I think that's really powerful. So listen to the conversation. She shares lots of tools and tips on how we can process our grief, and also really important questions that we can ask of ourselves as well to help us move through the grief. So check it out, have a listen. Let me know what you think. Take from it what you will. And to find out more on Victoria's work, you can go to www.theunleashedheart.com, and her podcast and all links to her work are there. And as always, I will have everything linked from my website, soulpowerlight.com, and click the podcast section. I've also linked a book there that Victoria mentioned during the conversation for children called When Children Grieve, if anyone is interested to look up that book. And just to mention as well, before we go into the episode, there are a few times when we were recording that you can hear a hoover in the background, and just wanted to bring it to your attention. It's kind of soothing. Don't let it distract you, but that's what it was. It was someone hoovering outside the door at times throughout the recording. But enjoy. Welcome everybody, and thanks for tuning and joining in for another episode. I have the wonderful Victoria Volk joining me today. So first of all, you're very welcome, Victoria.
Thank you, Karen. Excited to be here.
Yeah, really looking forward to our conversation today. I think it's a topic we all face, we all go through, but often we hide or we're afraid to talk about, and that is grief. You're an advanced grief specialist, and I love that that's your work. So I'd love for you to maybe describe a little bit more about your work or what it entails.
I am certified through the Grief Recovery Institute, and what I offer and facilitate are various programs that the Grief Recovery Institute has brilliantly put together. We have the Grief Recovery Method, which is based on the book that you can get on Amazon, the Grief Recovery Handbook, and it's within a group program or one-on-one. I can actually facilitate that one-on-one online now as an advanced specialist. And it's a time-based program, and it's also evidence-based. It's evidence proven to help people move beyond grief in their life. And then they also have a Helping Children with Loss program, pet loss program. It's, amazing, brilliantly written.
Fantastic.
And it's just about grief.
Fantastic. Yeah, really important topic. And I'm curious as well, what led you to this work as well?
My own grief, actually. I am 30 plus years a griever. My father passed away when I was a child. I ended up having another loss I realized I wasn't okay. And that was at the end of 2018. 2014, I kind of had a midlife crisis of sorts, where my grief really, really came to the forefront of my life. I'd closed a business. My youngest was going to kindergarten. A lot of transition and change that I really didn't know how to process what I was feeling. So that really is what set me off into this personal development tailspin. And it wasn't until, like I said, almost 5 years later, I had another loss in my life that kind of ripped off the Band-Aid or the scab, I should say. And I realized I wasn't okay. I did a Google search. I was looking for something for myself, but also too, I wanted to help others. I really just felt this deep desire to serve others. And I had a photography business. So, it was all about capturing people's memories, like freezing a moment in time of their most precious people in their lives, or their most amazing moments, like a wedding. And so everything just kind of led to this work, really.
Yeah, well, I love that. Experience and having gone through it as well is a huge support when helping others as well, because you know what it feels like. And, you mentioned there as a child, you lost your dad. And what is, I suppose, children and coping with loss is a huge aspect in and of itself. How was it for you? Do you have memories, or what happened? Not as in what happened, in your dad passing, but what happened for you afterwards? Was there any understanding or comprehension, or what was your experience?
I was very much aware that my dad was sick. He had colon cancer, so I actually watched him change his colostomy bag. I remember the smell. There are things that are burned in my memory as far as his decline in health, because he survived for 2 years after his diagnosis. And when he was diagnosed, it was already stage 4.
Wow.
So he really held on for a long time. And, I'll have to ask, but I don't even think he did chemo or radiation. I know he had surgery. Like I said, he had most of his colon removed and had a colostomy bag. But for me as a kid, there wasn't a lot of conversation about what was to come. And so when he did pass, he ended up going into the nursing home. My mom and my sister cared for him as long as they could in our home. At the same time, my mother's grandmother was dying of melanoma, and she was also living with us.
Wow.
So my grandma passed away, and her mother passed away, and then I believe it was within a year her husband passed away. So there was just a lot of grief in my home. My sister then, the same year my dad passed, she moved. She, graduated from high school and joined the Air Force, and so she left. A lot of change, a lot of upheaval, emotional disturbance, and just not a lot of conversation about what I was feeling. My mom I knew what my mom was feeling because she was really wrapped up in her own emotion, and rightfully so. Like she was emotionally unavailable to help me. And so it really created this separation of emotional connection to my mom that has lasted my entire life, to be honest. And it's something that this program actually has helped me work to repair, and has changed my life in the process. And with children, I actually just recently recorded the 20th episode of my podcast, Grieving Voices, and I dig more deeply into childhood grief and how to support a child who is grieving. And actually, too, the Institute has the book, When Children Grieve. That's what the program is based on. So if anyone wants more information on that. But yeah, it carried throughout my entire life. On a cellular level, grief changes us.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for sharing that as well. And I didn't realize we actually have a lot in common. I lost my dad to colon cancer as well. I know the colostomy bag, that smell, but I was 27 versus 8, but still, grief is grief. So a lot of memories coming up for me there as well. And definitely encourage people to go listen to your podcast, particularly with children. It's not something we'll delve into now, but I'd just love to know, what would you have loved at that time? With the perspective now and looking back, what would you have, or what would really have supported you?
Well, as a society, we're all taught pretty similarly the same things, most of us, because when it comes to grief, parents resort to what they know and what they've been taught. And if they haven't received new knowledge or new education about grief and how to process it and how to deal with it, how to work through it, instead of stuffing it down and all these other behaviors that we tend to resort to, that teaching gets passed on. Yeah. And so there's myths of grief that we talk about in grief recovery, and one of them is grieve alone, and replace the loss is another one. And so as a kid, I'm a very sensitive person, highly sensitive person, and and what people tell me when I was a kid is that I cried a lot. And I would go and hide to cry. I would go in the closet to cry, the linen closet to cry, the kitchen cupboard to cry. And I often went under my bed to cry, and I would fall asleep. So I learned very early on that you grieve alone. And that's something that was a belief of mine. These form our beliefs and how we then deal with grief as an adult. We don't forget that stuff. No. It's ingrained in us as children.
Yeah, so true. And yeah, that message or that belief of grieve alone, I'm sure so many people can relate to that. We feel it's something for us to deal with, although there may be others around us. You know, it's a very like that kind of your own internal. It's nearly like, and you know, maybe how can we lean more into it and open and change the conversation around it? Because like that, you could be a family grieving, but everyone grieves alone. It's not like, you know, maybe it does happen, but it's more like a solitary experience. So how could we change the conversation around that and, you know, release some of the stigma and that need or feeling that it needs to be isolated or kept hidden?
Yeah, and I was just thinking, I didn't really answer your question directly. What I would have needed, what I wish I would have had at that time was an open conversation. I think too with kids, but even just when supporting other grievers, if we go first, like especially if a family as a collective is grieving a loss, go first. Share how you're feeling. Share memories. But it's when we start to criticize, analyze, and judge what others are feeling. And that's the harm that we do when it comes to helping those we love or know or support in grief, because we're always going to resort to what we know, right? And so if we're uncomfortable with our grief, we are not a safe space for other people. We are not a person that can be a heart with ears for others. It's just very difficult. I think people might argue, yes, I am. I can listen, but you're always going to put it through a filter of your beliefs, right? So if you believe that, well, 30 years have passed, I should be over this death by now. 30 years passed, I should be over my dad dying, right? That's been said to me, actually. Wow. But grief doesn't go away because we love. Yeah. And we have a loss of hopes, dreams, and expectations, and that's what grief is. Anything that we wish to would have been different, better, or more. And those feelings don't just go away. But what I've learned is that there is a way to not be sucked into the past and think of that person with fondness and the happy times, and not be pulled then back into what you've lost, what, you know, the sad things or the sad memories or the, you know, maybe even the painful memories, because every relationship is unique and individual. And so you can have 3 people who experience the same loss, but their grieving experiences will be very different because their relationship was different. So we can't expect others to grieve the same way we would when their relationship to that person was very different from ours.
Yeah, that's so true. And especially it is that getting comfortable. You know, you mentioned when we're uncomfortable with our grief, we can't be there for others. And, you know, you mentioned as well, stuffing down is what you did. And I think a lot of people can relate to that stuffing down, suppression, just denial, avoiding, going, okay, yeah, it's been a week, 2 weeks, a month, a year, you know, I need to get over it, so to speak. So what are some of through your work, some tools or practices that can help people to get more comfortable and like that, just lean into it and, you know, be with it, the grief?
Yeah,
or the sense of loss.
You got to feel it to heal it. Yeah, you've got to feel it to heal it. When we stuff down, and that is a learned behavior, and when we do that, and we do that for decades, years, months, whatever, it doesn't matter. Eventually, we will implode or we will explode. When we implode, it affects our health, our physical bodies, and we will resort to behaviors to make ourselves feel better for a short period of time, whether it be shopping, gambling, sex, porn, exercise can be a STIRB, short-term energy relieving behavior. Food's a biggie. Workaholism, so many different things. And if we explode, we can have just anger that is always there. Think of yourself as a tea kettle, right? If you don't, you know, when you get the tea kettle and it's starting to whistle, that's our bodies. That's us. That's our container that we are in. And either we release that or we just keep simmering. And so the process of processing grief through the grief recovery method is a 7 or 8 week process. Depends if you're online or in person. But for people listening, people, I think when you say, oh, just journal it out, and people I think they roll their eyes at that. Like, oh, really? Okay, another journal it out. But people who do that likely have never tried it.
Yeah.
I've been journaling since I was a teenager. That was my outlet. That's how I processed my grief, what I was feeling, what I was experiencing. Now, some people are not people who process things internally. That is my nature. And some people do better with talking it out. Some people just have to talk it out.
Yeah.
And so if that is you, then look for somebody who doesn't criticize, analyze, or judge, that you can have an open conversation with, that you feel held, where they can just listen. Then they're a safe person.
Yeah.
Also, too, it's, if there's someone that when you start talking and they start comparing their loss to yours, or, like if you had a loss and you're trying to talk to someone about it and they start saying, well, when my sister's brother's neighbor's son had this happen, we start to get into these stories of, because we're trying to relate. We're uncomfortable with what is being said to us. So we're trying to find a connection point, something to relate to them.
Yeah.
And that's why people do that, because they're uncomfortable. That's not a safe person. I think just listening to your intuition on that as well. I think in grief too, I think what happened was true for me is that I really lost sight of my intuition. I did not know how to tap into it. I'm a very much a feeler person. I can walk in a room and I can get a sense for the energy of the room or the energy of the person, which I've just have been really gaining a better understanding of in the last year and a half. I personally need some decompression time after I've been out and about, and I never knew why. But yeah, we're always learning about ourselves, and we can always learn from others about ourselves through their stories, through their experiences and things like that. So you have to feel it to heal it. And that's going to look different for everybody on how that translates. Whether it's writing, talking it out. Meditation is amazing for helping you get out of your emotional state and into, I like to say, like, pop the cork, basically pop the cork of your brain and just let your mind go. And for a lot of people, that's really difficult because our minds are, we have hamsters on the wheel in our brains and it's constantly going, which is mine. And if that is you likely very much need meditation because you can't turn it off. And so that's a reset for me personally. And there are many apps that guide you through guided meditations to help you do that. Insight Timer is my favorite for that.
Love that one as well. So much information there you shared, really, really powerful. And yes, feel it to heal it. And I love that analogy of implode or explode, because that's exactly what happens when we stuff down in general, whether it's grief or anything. Once we deny or suppress or, avoid any emotion, they can happen, because emotions, like you said, we have to feel them. They're there to be felt. That's the only way for us to process them. But again, it's very much our society as well, and we're not taught anything really about emotional intelligence or about how to deal with them.
I have a Post-it note that I keep on my desk, and it says, "You are where your attention is." And so, when you're deep in grief, of course, or you're having a bad day and, that's where your attention is. My question would be then, a self-awareness question would be is, how long do I want to stay in this? Because you have to feel it to heal it, but it's when it's impacting our lives in such a way that, when I think about my own grief, like 30 plus years, I think, oh my gosh, if I would have had the knowledge and the education and the self-awareness that I have now 10 years ago, where would I be today? And I think in grief, it's like you feel like it's never going to end. This is how it's just going to be. This is how it is. It is what it is. And this is this is my life now. Like, this is my life now. That's really truly how I felt. And I think how many grievers feel. And you feel like you don't have a choice. Grief steals you of feeling like you have a choice.
Yeah.
But you do. You do. Every day you have a choice on where your attention is. And so we start to transition from deep grief and loss to hope and evolution of who we are when we start asking ourselves better questions. What do I want for the rest of my life? How do I want to feel? And you can, maybe sometimes too, we need to forgive ourselves, give compassion to ourselves before we can give it to anybody else. And I think that's too in grief. It's one lesson I think a lot of grievers walk away with is you become more compassionate because you really know pain.
Yeah.
There are beautiful things that come of it. And I and I know people probably are rolling their eyes to that too, but I feel like I'm on the other side of it. And so my whole mission now is to normalize grief. It's normal, it's natural. But what isn't normal and natural is how we let it derail the entire rest of our lives.
Yeah.
Because that's not self-compassion, that's not self-love. And to be honest too, it costs our economy billions of dollars. It costs our lives so much joy. It doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, it's so true. And that thing of choice is so powerful as well. I remember years ago when I went through a really traumatic breakup, literally my ex had emailed me and he disappeared and I've never heard from him since. And I just felt like my whole world fell apart and I was obliterated into a billion pieces. And I mean, I couldn't breathe from all the crying and the shock and everything that comes with that. But then after a while like that I had an awakening a couple of days later, and it was that thing of choice. And it was like, yes, Karen, like, this is your reality. This has happened. So I can stay miserable and crying and not talking to anyone and not eating and being angry and miserable, and rightfully so. Or I can accept this and start to piece my life again. And in that moment, I swear, I hadn't realized I had a choice before then. And I was just like, oh yes. And that didn't mean that I still didn't feel the pain, but like that, when those surges came up and that deep grief and that pain and that panic and fear and loss, I could be with it and I could sit with it and process it. Because when we do that as well, they dissipate again. It wasn't an all day, everyday scenario from then on. They would rise, absolutely. But I would be with it, and then I come back to reality, for want of a better word, or present moment, and being like, okay, well, I still focus on all the beauty that is around me, all the love that is around me. It helps you appreciate the people, the things you have even more, because you have that kind of wake up that, well, anything can change in a second. And again, it's not to live in fear or anything like that, but for me, it was such a massive mindset shift in that realization that, well, I still have a choice. And those questions that you ask, like, how long do I want to stay like this? Like, yes, honor the compassion, feel it, but it is our choice then as well, like you said, in when we're ready to work through it and ask better questions of ourselves and come back to that compassion and come back to presence as well again. So super important. And as they say as well, the quality of our life depends on the quality of our questions as well. It is huge to ask ourselves these questions, I think, anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. People who may be listening, they might be asking too, well, what if something that happened to me is very traumatic and it wasn't my fault and it happened to me, like someone else did this to me? How do I get past that? Right. I've been in that position, and that's where forgiveness comes in. Forgiveness is a huge piece and a huge pillar of grief recovery work. And that's often the most difficult, because especially when we've been on the receiving end of an offender, and and experience something very traumatic. And so there's a way out of that as well. I just, there's hope. I just
Yeah.
don't want people to lose hope. I want people to feel hopeful, because if we don't have hope, oh man, our minds become the master. Our
Yeah.
minds become the master, and it's a tailspin.
So true. And it's, for me as well, it's that reality as well, and that real waking up to life is full of loss, really. We all experience loss. There's absolutely nobody alive who's going to make it out in the first place. We're all going to pass. And again, that's not, I think once you wake up to that reality again, there's not the fear or the panic or the stress. Again, well, for me anyway, it just helps me be more present and connected and appreciative of every single moment, and not waste the moments, to really just appreciate even more and have that more compassion for myself and for others as well. Because, and even 2020, when you think about it, I'm like, this is a year of huge loss and grieving, whether people realize it or not. Like, people may have lost their jobs or their routine, or, being able to be out and about. Like, that's an element of loss as well. So it's again the allowance and the acceptance and, the acknowledgement that it's always there and it's okay. Like we mentioned earlier as well, changing the conversation around it. Well, I suppose even like you mentioned it, learning to get more comfortable with it, realizing it's a part of life and it's okay. Yes, it will knock us off balance, so to speak, when something happens, but we have the resources. And like you mentioned earlier, when we have the knowledge and the education and the self-awareness, we can still kind of piece ourselves back together and make choices no matter what.
And that's what empowers you too, right? The knowledge, the education, feeling like you have a choice, that's empowering.
Totally.
And I want to highlight something you mentioned too, because you're talking about these different losses, which grief isn't just about death. It's anything that you wish would have been different, better, or more. Regarding, like, typically it's relationships, or loss of hopes, dreams, and expectations. But we have loss and for a child, their first experience could be, let's say, their pet dies, or their blankie gets taken away, which can be traumatic for a child. Yeah. We have those experiences, all of us, at some point in childhood. And so because grief is cumulative and it's cumulatively negative, those losses stack up in our lives. And so the more loss that we have experienced and that we haven't processed, it's like an onion. It's just like another layer gets added, another layer gets added, another layer gets added. And so the process of grief recovery is peeling back the layers one by one. Yeah. And sometimes we can experience like this epiphany or have this light bulb moment in our lives that like changes everything for us. But for most of us, it's this slow going unraveling. And there is no right or wrong way to process what we're feeling, but that's where I really encourage people to listen to their intuition and think about what keeps coming up in your life that you're not paying attention to, right? That there's something that's like, for me, it was Reiki. I kept hearing about Reiki, like Reiki this, Reiki that. And I'm like, what is Reiki? And I started to dig into it. What is Reiki? And I never experienced a Reiki session before in my life. And if you're not familiar, it's energy healing. And I went and got certified. I'm a Reiki master, and I went just recently, finished up with my Karuna Holy Fire Reiki certification, which is just another level. But that really has helped me too, like understand that our thoughts have energy. We are energy on a cellular level, and grief has energy, right? So that was what was coming up for me. And it's like, I needed that. I needed it. And now I get to share it with other people and help them reduce their stress, sleep better, give them an emotional and energetic reset. So think about what's coming up for you in your life that you perhaps may be ignoring or dismissing, and something that interests you. If it interests you, there's a reason, whether it be a certain coach or a certain book or something. There's something that you need if it keeps showing up in your life. And that's really made a huge impact and difference throughout my whole personal development journey.
Yeah.
Really.
I love that. And it's so true. Well, I love what you mentioned there as well. It's an accumulated effect, the loss and the grief, and it builds and builds and builds. And then I suppose it either comes back to what you said earlier, then we implode or we explode. So
Bingo.
Yeah, that's really powerful that, so that's the importance of dealing with it as we move along and feel it to heal it. And you mentioned loads of practices, whether it's journaling, whether it's talking to someone, and that may not have to be someone in your family like that. It could be a neutral person who can just really just hold that space for you and not judge or criticize, or you feel like you have to hold certain things back. So loads of different things, but most importantly as well, as you mentioned just now as well, following your intuition. Like, again, it's that old cliche of we know exactly what we need, or we have everything inside of us, but when we're not listening, when we're clouded, we don't believe it, we think it's our imagination or it's just a crazy thought. But explore, get curious, follow them, because that is where the help is as well. And it's so funny you mentioned Reiki as well. Reiki came into my life just before the big breakdown in my life as well, and like that I had never received a session or anything beforehand, but it just came up and I was like, oh, okay. And then afterwards I was like, oh my God, I am so grateful I have these tools as well. And that is the power of personal development and self-education. Like, these are the real life skills in my eyes. You don't find them in school. So that's the path of self-exploration as well. And it's so powerful and beautiful. But before we wrap up as well, I would love to know, and I'm sure you've mentioned it throughout the conversation, but I'd love to know as well just what grief has taught you.
Oh boy. Grief and I are best friends.
Amazing.
I am who I am because of my grief. And I am in the work that I'm doing because of my grief. And I do want to circle back to something you said, because it made me think of another thought regarding, because you said, it doesn't have to be a person in your family who you talk to. Mm. And I just want to highlight that it likely won't be, because typically a perfect person who is a heart with ears has no skin in your game.
Yeah.
They got nothing to gain and they got nothing to lose. And that's usually the best person to be your heart with ears. And I also want to share too, because grief is cumulative and it's cumulatively negative, this self-education, the tools that are out there. There's so many tools, healing modalities, all these different things. As we start to bring those things into our lives, those are cumulative as well. So it's that polarity of, okay, which way do I want the pendulum to swing?
Yeah.
And, and helps bring balance to the darkness. We have to add some light to bring balance to the dark, right? So what grief has taught me is that it's given me my PhD in life.
Yeah.
Can I say that?
I bet. Yeah.
It's shaped every decision I've ever made in my life. I joined the military. I started a business, becoming a mother, starting another business. It impacts every decision we make. It influences every decision we make. And I can look back and I can see the pattern of, I was very indecisive. I had a really difficult time making decisions, actually, until I started to do some personal work. I questioned everything. I wasn't in touch with my intuition. I really struggled in many ways. And I didn't trust myself. And so if I've learned anything from grief, is that it's going to ebb and it's going to flow and it's going to be a downpour and it's going to be just a little mist at times. Yeah. I don't know, you can use any analogy you want, but it does teach us. That's the nutshell of it, is grief does teach us. And how open do we want to be to its teachings is the question.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining today as well, because I think your story and the work that you're doing, it's so empowering, and how now you relate to grief as your best friend, and you have that appreciation because you see all the lessons it has taught you along the way, but you also realize that it was you who had to start swinging the pendulum in the other way. So, I think it's really inspiring and empowering for people as well to be like, yeah, there will be ebb and flows, feel it, accept it. But again, it's how do you choose to move through it again, and how do you choose to grow and learn and evolve from it, because everything is lessons as well. But again, it comes down to us to doing the work in the first place. And I think especially this year, it's time for everyone, if we don't have some kind of a daily practice or some connection to our intuition, to explore that path, because we will need to be working through it constantly. So I love that. And I've really enjoyed today's conversation as well, Victoria. So please, will you share where people can find more information as well on your work?
Yeah, my website is theunleashedheart.com. I have my podcast. I have a Grieving Voices podcast link there as well. On there is also a link to my newsletter that I send out weekly. And yeah, pretty much all the links are there. And on Instagram, I'm at The Unleashed Heart. And on Facebook, Victoria The Unleashed Heart.
Fantastic. I love that name as well, The Unleashed Heart. And as always, I will have everything linked on the show notes directly to all your various platforms. So thank you so much, Victoria, for joining today. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you for having me, Karen. And never lose hope. Never lose hope.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you get notified every time a new show is released. Get more information on this week's guest as well on my website, www.soulpowerlight.com.